So today I have the honor to talk to Peter Seeberger, who's the director of the Max Planck Institute for Colloids and Interfaces and the man revolutionizing medicine by sugar. He's a visionary chemist and entrepreneur whose innovation reached from vaccines to sustainable medicine and drug production. My name is Andreas Reiser. I'm mentor for the Max Planck Startup Initiative. And my first question is, are scientists good entrepreneurs?
I think as always, there are probably some good ones and not so good ones, and everything in between.
So you say there are good ones and there are not so good ones. What I see when I talk to scientists, many of them, they are interested, they're curious, but they are not sure and aware if they have the potential and even the interest in being out there as an entrepreneur. So if I was a scientist and I'd like to find out if I could potentially be a good entrepreneur, what is your hint? How could I identify myself as an entrepreneur?
If you want to do new things, if you're willing to take a risk, if you're willing to translate your science into products to meet demand by other people, I think then entrepreneurship could be for you. And what I try to say by scientists being good or bad entrepreneurs, I think there's no correlation between being a great scientist and being a great entrepreneur. I think it really depends what it is you like. And as always in life, we are typically good at things we like. And that's why I think it's really difficult to try to force people to be entrepreneurs. The only thing that we should do, and what I think that I'm trying to do, is to tell people, look, there is this whole cosm of entrepreneurship that's really important for our society, moving us forward. And you as a scientist may well be a good entrepreneur, but you only know it when you try it. And so I think opening the eyes of young people, particularly towards this cosm of entrepreneurship, is something that we can do as scientists and science managers to some degree. And I think after that, it is also a matter of role models. If you can point to people that have done that, done it successfully, I think then it becomes easier because people look at it and say, well, I'm not any more stupid than that other person. I could do the same thing. So why don't I try? And I think getting people to that point, that is actually what we would like to do. By the end of the day, we cannot and we should not try to force anybody to do that.
I think you also have some role models here on the Institute. So do you connect scientists to these role models? So if I was interested in finding out more, do you directly connect them?
So I think what we want to create is to create an environment or a biotope, if you will, where different people get together. And that is what we can shape as directors of institutes and more experienced people. Because another thing I found out is a role model like myself, who is in the late 50s, is maybe not a great role model for somebody in their 20s. Because they say, oh, look, this old guy, yeah, I mean, he's just got a nice job sitting in his cushy office, and then these companies just come out by chance. I think it's much more important to see what do people, their peers in the same age group, how do they do it? Or a little bit older maybe, because that's easier to relate to. And I think that's why we need this in all age groups. And what I found out in our institute is that, yes, I did start my first two companies over 20 years ago at MIT, and then a number of them afterwards. But people seeing that then start their own companies. And many of my former coworkers have gone on to top jobs in industry. Many became professors, but also a number of them started their own companies. And I think other people seeing that then realize that that is one potential pathway after finishing a PhD or after doing postdoctoral work. It's not academia or industry, but it's also this entrepreneurial thing. And so being part of this overall biotope is important because when people see that, they can connect that. And the other thing we see oftentimes, people may not go in this direction early on, but they say, it's something that's interesting, and they may be in a company for a few years, and then they say, oh, but I have a good scientific background. I went to a company, I saw this done in a big company, and now I'm starting my own company. So I think it's not always this direct thing, okay, you see a role model, immediately do that, but actually it's something you may keep back of your mind, a little bit like what you learned from your parents maybe, and all of a sudden you go the same direction, knowingly, unknowingly.
So it's something that takes time sometimes to from the first idea, hey, I could do my own business, until the point you do it?
I think some people come in and say, well, I want to do my own company.
Yeah.
I was never one of those. So I said, I want to be an academic scientist. I want to be a professor. I knew that from grade 5 on. And luckily, I was a professor about the age of 30. And that was it. But early in my career, I realized that we made some discoveries, some very fundamental scientific discoveries that were able to address certain needs that people had. In our case, people wanted to have carbohydrates because carbohydrates were important in medicine and very important in vaccines. And so opening this opportunity of making the things that people wanted gave a commercial opportunity. And then the question comes, do I do this by myself through my own company, or do I try to connect to companies that can do this? In my particular case, what happened was that large companies said, well, this area of glycobiology, that's not really interesting. That's not been any movement in 20, 30, 40 years. Yes, there was a discovery by Seeberger now, but very risky. And most of the companies who started when I was involved was where there was a need in the marketplace where people said we would like to have that. And we realized large companies don't want to go in because it's too risky. And this is when we start companies.
Quite often when I ask scientists, hey, what's the advantage of your findings? They're not really aware of it. They know that what they found is groundbreaking in a way, but they don't know what it's good for. Now, you just said you identified there's a need out there. And how can you close this gap?
I think it depends very much on what we're talking about. So in my particular case, I did something very fundamental. There are 3 classes of biopolymers, and one class being carbohydrates, sugars. And you think of your coffee where you put your sugar in. That's also sugar, but the sugars we are talking about is the sugars that make up cell walls, make up the trees outside. Cellulose is a sugar, and there's just so many functions. And so we opened up really a humongous platform. And what we realized that after we published our first paper in Science at that time, people said, oh, I would like to get this sugar or that sugar. Can you make that for me? And in the beginning, we did that through collaboration. But eventually we said, well, we'd like to pay you for it. We said, well, but we can't take that money because I'm a university professor and I cannot tell you what I'm making. And so that's when one of my students said, well, maybe I could just start a company. And we did that together out of MIT at the time to address this need, where people said, we want that. And then a little downstream, people came and said, oh, but in vaccines, these carbohydrates are also very important. You can make them now. That gives us a new way of doing this. Well, could you help us with that? And so I think oftentimes, of course, we knew the scientific literature. We knew in principle what's interesting. But what really were societal issues or economic issues, we weren't so much aware of it. And what I learned is when the more you start talking to people in industry, the more you learn. And I think that was something that I saw at MIT. There was a very close connection between industry and academia. And in Germany, funny enough, that same connection existed over 100 years ago. Most of the pharmaceutical industry in Germany was started by academic professors collaborating with large chemical pharmaceutical companies. And today we oftentimes say, oh, it's very bad that you work with companies. I mean, I can see many downsides, but at the same time, the companies know where there are certain key factors that have to be overcome to make a process more effective or make a new drug or something. And they don't have the time or the interest to really do the deep research needed. We at Max Planck are in a fantastic position where we can do anything we want. Sure. And if I make real breakthrough science, I may be able to open up a whole area, not just to go to one product, that's not my interest, but to really open up an entire area, which maybe I don't have to reduce to practice, but somebody else can reduce to practice later on. And I think that's always, we try to keep an open mind, but I do not want to do any, what I would call applied research. It's like, okay, Peter, make this particular product. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in fundamental questions that say, okay, if we can solve that fundamental question, that will open a path into a much wider area of research that may also have applications in the commercial setting.
And what you just shared, you actually, people came to you after you published in Science. So, and actually, I think this is opening a very interesting aspect because you didn't approach the industry by yourself. Initially, they approached you because they're reading something about your findings, and that started the whole process. They said, hey, actually, there's a interest, need, interest, and a way to bring your science into society.
I have to also admit, of course, my own PhD advisor in the United States was a good role model because he started a company called Amgen, the largest biotech company in the world. And when I published that paper, he called me and said, well, I think you may have something really fundamental. You should also start a company. And so role models encouraging other people are important. In my case, that was also one of the things. So again, I think it's multifactorial. It's not just one thing. If that happens, then you should start a company. But I think it's also not one way of doing it. I mean, maybe somebody said, I really want to start a company. I'm not saying it's wrong. Just in my case, it never happened that way.
So you have excellent science, that's given. But this is only one part of becoming an entrepreneur. And my impression is that quite often you also need coincidence, luck, and some other components you cannot plan. What's your opinion about that?
Well, my opinion is that those who are smart and work hard will be more often lucky than those who are lazy and not so smart. That's my strong belief. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's, at least I like to believe that. The other thing, it's about environment. An environment that's encouraging to people to try things. I think in Max Planck Society, we are very lucky to have a fantastic environment, fantastic freedom, unparalleled freedom in my mind compared to any other place I've been. I've been to top places. So the question is then, how can we make sure more people might be interested in actually starting companies and contributing things into society? I think it's really what we said earlier, to keep an open mind. They say it's not about publishing this one paper, but maybe I want to go to the next step. And in my particular case, working on drugs and vaccines, it's very clear. I can show in an animal experiment what I made is protecting an animal in a model from a disease. That's nice, and I can publish a nice paper, but I would like to prevent disease in humans, right? In people's kids and themselves. And doing that on a mouse is not satisfying. If I really want to go to humans, it's very, very hard to do that in an academic environment, including the Max Planck Society, because that's what we are set up to do. And if I want to go all the way and make this possible, then oftentimes getting this into a commercial setting is the only way of how I'm going to move forward. Because if you think about developing a vaccine today, it will cost you between 1 and 1.2 billion euros. So that means nobody, not even Max Planck Society, can put that money in to develop this. It's also not our job, right? But for society, such a vaccine can be a total game changer. But that risky endeavor is often only financed by industry or by venture capitalists. And so the only way to get to that final goal, which is really good for society, is actually going to be an entrepreneur, take the risk, and move it forward. And the other thing is, many of these trials fail. Drug discovery is a very risky and very lengthy process, one of the worst of any product we made. But as a society, we benefit if you have new drugs and new vaccines.
Your findings were amazing, not only amazing, they got a very good impact, great impact, and you got a good response. Did it also happen that you had a groundbreaking finding and a few people didn't appreciate it?
Oh, that's always the case. So I mean, no matter what you do, right? There's always going to be critics and people are going to be jealous also. And I always tell my students, look, pity you get for free. Jealousy you have to work for. If you do something good, there'll always be people say, it's not going to work. Oh, it wasn't that great anyway. It was obvious. And if it's a commercial success, anybody could have done this. Yeah, maybe it's true, but somebody had to do it. Might as well be us. So I think it's really important not to worry too much about what other people think. I'm not trying to say dismiss other people's opinions.
Yeah.
Don't be arrogant. I think that's the end of all. That's really bad.
Yeah.
But I think there's always naysayers, and people will say, look, this is too risky. And I think it's, at the same time, it's very important when you assess the risk. How high is my risk of failure? I mean, you're also using money. Your own money in many cases, other people's money, maybe your friend's money, even worse. And if you lose that and there's no return, that's horrible.
Yeah.
But honestly, you do the same thing at Max Planck Society. Because Max Planck Society, I get to do all this nice research with taxpayers' money, other people's money. So it's my damn job to do the best possible science and to ideally deliver something back to society that finances me, that I can do this nice research for my students. And we know that every euro spent in research comes back sevenfold afterwards to society. It's never quite clear how long that takes until it comes back sevenfold, and it doesn't always come back in every single case. But overspending of society into research, we know that it's an investment in the future that will pay back 7 times.
So actually then we should invest way more into science, obviously.
Of course, I mean, that's, any scientist will tell you that. I think that's clear. But I think in Germany, we are doing a good job, and we continue to do a good job, even in difficult times, to invest in science. We also complain, but we really shouldn't, because it's pretty good. Of course, it can always be better, but it's really, really good. But I think what I like to see more of is trying to show that the things which were discovered in Germany, at the Max Planck Society and other places, actually are reduced to practice here. Because by the end of the day, this investment of society into us and in science will lead to progress. And the question is, does it lead to progress here in Germany right now, in jobs, in tax money again from jobs, or does it result in jobs and tax money somewhere else? And honestly, if we spend our tax money, I think it would be just fair if we do it here. And that's why I'm a big proponent of trying to actually create companies here in Germany.
You mentioned the ecosystem, the role of an ecosystem, that this is crucial, and you have a good ecosystem here. Now, if I would be a scientist from another institute and I would think about, maybe my ecosystem is not so good. What's your opinion about the ecosystem with Max Planck in general, the Max Planck Society? And what's your opinion about the startup ecosystem in Germany, and what are potential ways it could be improved?
So I think in Germany, we have a lot of complaints. And when you compare it, of course, to Boston or to maybe Silicon Valley, yes, we are not at the same level. That's very clear. If we compare it to America overall, it may be a different picture already. And within Germany, of course, there are some hotbeds where it's easier. So first, we need good science. And I think in Germany, there are many places, universities, other institutions that have great science. We have great scientists, also great. I think that's one thing. The other thing we need good business people, and we need money. And one of the limitations that I found in Germany is that the science is as good or better than in the US. That was a professor at MIT, which is also not a bad place, but I would say Max Planck is at least at the same level. But unfortunately, we are successful only in a fraction of cases to actually make companies out of that in Germany. And I think it's partially because people may not be so used to trying to translate things. And the second is ecosystem we talked about earlier, because there's a scientific aspect of that. And I think in Germany, that's very good. We have centers of excellence, many good people, but that's a necessary part of it, but it's not a decisive part. By the end of the day, the money also decides, because you have to have financing. If you give some money, and in Germany it's extremely good with the government actually giving seed funding, but it's not just seed funding. It's going to be small rounds of capital, 5, 10 million, larger rounds in the 50s, and then hundreds of millions. And the early rounds are very risky, particularly in drug discovery. And I think there's a much lower appetite by investors in Europe, in Germany, for those highly risky investments compared to the US. So the total amount of money in the US is much higher compared to Germany. And that has mainly to do with the retirement system, because all the American pensions are invested in pension funds. The pension funds are investing, and we're also investing in venture capital. In Germany, we do it in a different way, our retirement system. So there's much less money in the system, and less money in the system means less money for companies. And I think that just means less money goes into projects, less money in projects, less companies, less role models. So let's just say there is money, there are scientists, we also need people to run the companies. And many of those people who run the companies by the end of the day may not be scientists. No, they may have a business degree, and they have to come together with scientists. And my first company, we started out of MIT with my first PhD student, a chemist, and with a business school student. And we got together because of the MIT business plan contest. And we just did it for fun. And then we sort of said, okay, let's now move that forward together. But what's important is to bring the business people together with the science people. And I think that's an area in Germany where I see a lot of room for improvement, because there's very few venues where the science and the business people can come together.
So one thing clearly is money. The other thing is the connection to business. What's the right timing to bring in the business people? Because I think there is also a too early and not too late.
Yeah. So I don't have a good answer for that. But I think what happens, let's say, in a good environment, there's constantly an exchange between scientists, potential entrepreneurs from business side, and financial people. If, for example, go to Boston, there are people around the large universities, MIT, Harvard, that were alumni possibly from those places, that started companies, just sold the company, come back in again, and then they see, okay, that actually could fit to me. Because some of the business people are really good for a brand new startup company, but they lose interest when you're above 25, 50 people. Some people are good from 50 to 500 people. And that fit has to be there. And it's almost impossible to say, okay, for this particular venture, I really want to work with this person, because that's what really gets us together. So in the ecosystem, there are all kinds of people, and it has to match for this particular purpose of achieving that. And of course, as you get older, and I've done this a few times, you know much better. For this particular thing, we may want to talk to this person. Give you an example. One of the group leaders in my department discovered a fantastic new way to diagnose endometriosis. Endometriosis is a very painful disease, affects 10% of females around the world. The diagnostic time in Germany today, 7 years. 7 years. They can do it in 1 day. So they said, okay, how are we going to do that? They start to work with Max Planck Society, with Maximize program. And then I had in mind, I know a former Max Planck alumnus who left over 20 years ago, had a successful startup company, was sort of semi-retired on his farm in northern Germany. And I called him and said, well, do you want to have dinner with this entrepreneur from my department? Maybe you guys can hit it off. Long story short, we had a fantastic evening talking to each other. It took a few months to basically get them together. And what we're doing is basically matchmaking. Where we know, okay, it could fit from a personality standpoint. It fits from a timing standpoint. There's a person who has done this successfully, person who's never done this. They come in together. And then that's how we basically build that. And it's a little bit maybe like dating, right? It's not a first time, but this always work, right? And I think the issue is very clearly, as you have more people in one place, it becomes easier because then the connections can be made more straightforward. And I think that's why in the US, if you look at Boston or San Francisco, that's where you see activities, because there is a critical mass of people who have done this so many times. And have also in many cases failed, because that's the other thing. People build companies, the company may have failed for no particular wrongdoing on the part of the people in the company, wrong timing or whatever, right? Many, many reasons can be there. But they learned a lot of doing this. And the second time they do it, may do it differently.
How big is the role of failure and obstacles?
So it's interesting because I talked to somebody who's in a Max Planck Senate, a very famous manager who ran one of the largest German companies. I won't mention my name now. And he's a neurobiologist. And I said, how come you were a neurobiologist and now you're running a company with over 400,000 employees? What was essential? He said, I became very tolerant to failure. Because when you do experiments fail. And if you can't handle that, it'll be really difficult in science. And for us as chemists and biologists, things don't go always as planned, right? And you gotta get over it. If you can't do that, it's very difficult to get a PhD. So going through a PhD, 3-4 years of doing this, you have to develop some tolerance towards that. And what he told me is that tolerance is also extremely important in business, because you're gonna meet people, you can have good discussions, but it may not lead to anything productive. You gotta get over that, because otherwise you're always gonna think back of it, oh, we should have done it. Forget about it. Be tolerant to that, and then move forward.
I fully agree. And I just think, is it only tolerance, or is it also the ability to learn for the next time?
Of course, I think that's the other thing. First of all, when you take on a big project, PhD project, let's say, what I tell my students always is, hey, look, this is difficult, right? The easy stuff has been done before. It's a PhD project, it's difficult, and you are technically not that skilled yet, right? Yeah, you finished your PhD, your studies, everything good, but now you're gonna go in and you have to work practically, and there's a lot of mistakes you can make. So talk to your peers. Find out what works so you don't make those mistakes. Because there's still plenty of mistakes you can make by yourself. If you want to make every mistake by yourself, then it becomes really problematic. And I think in business it's the same thing, right? Certain things work, certain things don't work, other things may or may not work. And let's learn from everybody else. And that's again an advantage, I think, of a large network or an environment where there are many people that have gone through this. And I think that is another thing where I see coaching and meeting people who have done that before, not just as role models, because you may talk to somebody and say, well, you know, I'm thinking I have this discovery in my lab, and I would like to maybe apply this and go to market with this and this product. And this happened to me in the past. And people said, well, Peter, that's great, but have you thought about this? And I was like, no, because I don't know the first thing about this, right? And so I think getting input from people that have expertise in very different areas can be very, very good. Can also be very bad, right? There are bad ones, you just forget about it. But you have to learn to see your project or the things you're dealing with from somebody else's angle. And the other thing you may come out of that is somebody says, well, scientifically, that's really fantastic what you're doing. But from a business standpoint, it's really stupid. Don't do it. And if enough people say that, and if people have a lot of experience, at that moment you may ask yourself, well, maybe I don't want to do that because maybe it's really a stupid idea. Because all of us have many ideas, hopefully very creative. And for my case, I can say I have a lot of ideas, and many of them are really stupid. And I think the important thing is to sort of figure out which one are good ones and which one are bad ones. Let's work on good ones, and let's just not talk about the bad ones afterwards anymore.
So is the best scientific idea also from the commercial aspect the best idea?
No. I think we need to totally separate things which are scientific and business-wise. And I can say that if I think about a scientific project, never ever do I think about any commercial application afterwards. I'm purely driven by trying to explore scientific aspects. Like, give one example. In my lab, we were interested in turning around one electron. It sounds totally stupid to most people. Why do you want to do that? Because the oxygen we breathe has electrons in a certain way. And if you put light on this oxygen, you can turn around one of the electrons. The oxygen becomes a really active reagent that can oxidize other things. It's a very green oxidizing reagent because you can take light, you can take air, and you can then do chemistry. And I thought that's really cool. So we did that, and we could show that we could do it very efficiently. And that led us to afterwards to be able to make actually from light and oxygen and plant waste a malaria medication. Never ever did I plan to make a malaria medication. I didn't even know about it. I just wanted to turn around this one electron to make that oxygen because I thought it'd be cool to take that oxygen and do chemical reactions. So I'm trying to say is that oftentimes you do something and then that leads to something else, and eventually it could lead to a commercial application. And I think people who just look for commercial applications, not saying that's wrong, right? But it happens in companies, and that's a good place to do that, and maybe other research institutions. But I think at Max Planck, we should set the level high as the scientific companies if we want to go. And on a way of going there will be ideas and applications that come up. And I think the only thing we should do is we should keep an open mind and saying, this could be a possibility. And that leads also to the fact we can say, okay, I want to be an entrepreneur myself, or our students or coworkers can do this, or I try to go to companies and say, look, guys, we found this, and I think this could be very interesting for a company to do. I don't want to do it because I'm a scientist. I don't want to start a company, but it would be good if somebody looks into that. And I think we have to be open for all these things because there's not this one path that should be always followed. And that's what makes it so difficult to give people advice. Because there's not this one cookie cutter scheme where it's like, okay, if this happens, when you go to B and then eventually have a company.
Yeah.
Not like that at all. But again, I think that's why it's important to have these networks of people who have gone through that, because they can say, well, in my case, this happened and then we did this and that was really stupid, or we did that and that was really a good idea, or go talk to this person because that person knows a lot more than I do. And I think by the end of the day, the networks are really important to just get feedback.
When you found this malaria drug, could I say that this was life-changing for you because you are in Ethiopia super involved, and not by yourself, but you've founded a foundation. Was this the starting point?
Actually, it was different. We started a foundation in Africa 20 years ago in Ethiopia because with my first company we made some money, and so we had an opportunity to think about we could help people. And I had a friend who is from Ethiopia but lives in Switzerland, who I knew. I was a professor at ETH at the time. And I realized with quite small amounts of money, like the amounts of money that I have, we can really make a difference in people's lives in Africa. It's more difficult here, but we can make a difference. I worked on malaria vaccines, but those were never used afterwards. That was just a scientific interest that we had. And what we then realized is that when you work in Africa, you see certain things that really are difficult for people. And that is in the back of your mind when you do other research. So working on malaria medication afterwards was by total coincidence. It was the oxygen story that I thought we could do the oxygen. But then, of course, you realize, okay, malaria is really important. The drugs are too expensive for people in Africa. They are cheap for us. So if we have a chance to make that, we should do it because it would be a right thing to do for Africa. So I think it's like in a lifetime, you have many experiences and you keep them in mind, and you have something else happening. All of a sudden you realize, oh, but for my different part of my life, I know this part. So how about I try to use what I just found here and apply it? And I think that is important because you have this experience as you go along, and that's what I try to say about having a network, because somebody else may say, oh, but I can tell you this would be important. The endometriosis diagnostic, for example. Most males don't know what endometriosis is because it doesn't affect us, and that's why nobody worked on that for a long time. But all of a sudden, when you start talking to people and say, oh, this is a problem, have you guys thought about this? Then all of a sudden you can find solutions. And one of the biggest inspirations for me is the close collaboration with Leif Sander, one of my friends at Charité, who runs the infectious disease clinic there. And what he says, look, Peter, right now I have 2 young people in their 20s who are dying from a particular bug or a fungus, and we have no medication. And then I look at that and think, oh, but on the outside of that particular bug, there are sugars, what I work on, and they are known. So if we can chemically make those sugars, we may be able to actually create an antibody as a drug treatment, or we create a vaccine. And this is how a large number of projects started. Because I don't know what kills people in hospitals. I'm not a medical doctor, but they tell me, look, there's a need. If we would have this, we could help these people, they wouldn't have to die. I have a means to research that and address it, and then we have to put what the market says, basically, right? We have a need and bring that together with science, and then we can apply that. So I would encourage people to talk to other people that are not doing exactly the same thing as you, keep an open mind, and think about, okay, maybe what I do may have eventually something to do with that. And I think that's how progress is being made.
Talk, communicate, communicate.
Every now and then it also helps if you work. So I think that should not be forgotten, right? I think by the end of the day, if you only talk all day, that's also not good. I'm a big fan of actually working hard and getting stuff done.
Yes.
Because particularly in the areas that we work, in chemistry, engineering, and medicine, you got to do experiments. And I think a lot of time a library does not save you from doing experiments. By the end of the day, that's where the truth lies. And the other thing that's to remember for people, a lot of things we do fail. A lot of things I've done have failed. And as I said earlier, you got to get over it. You cannot just stick with it and be negative. But one thing is clear. If you don't try, it doesn't get done. And if you don't fail, it doesn't get done either. And I think that is the most important thing. We teach people to not look only at success, because success may or may not come, but it's important to do good science, learn how to do good science, do it, and apply yourself. And I think it's oftentimes today that people think like, oh, okay, I just work for a few days and then I have a great result.
No.
It's a little bit like in sports. I think you're not really going to be at the top of your game. It takes, I don't know, a good tennis player, somebody probably a decade or two to get to where we are. And I think in science, it's the same thing. We just have to realize this, right? And you have to work hard in order to be on top of your game.
So you said it's about working hard, and I completely agree on that. How big is the influence? I kind of asked this before, but going to another direction, how big is the influence of coincidence? And I'm asking this because in a former call, you told me in Vietnam you found something that is not known here, which inspired you then to continue your research. So
yeah, I think there is lots of coincidence. Lots of coincidence. You find things you didn't expect.
Yeah.
You have to pay attention, and that's do a good experiment. Don't just look for what you expect.
Yeah.
I think you talk to many Nobel Prize winners, they'll tell you what they found. They didn't expect it. It was totally unexpected. That's why I got a Nobel Prize, because completely unexpected. I think doing only experiments to get the totally unexpected is also not going to work, right? So you got to go along certain lines. And I think coincidence also of meeting the right people is important. That gets us back to communication, because if you only ever sit in your lab and never go outside, that becomes very difficult. But I think that's true actually for both doing good science. It is in our area, because we work very transdisciplinary. We have chemists, we have immunologists, we have engineers who communicate with each other. I could see other areas where maybe really it's in one area. But where we work, this communication is important. And the other thing I learned from most of the applications and in companies, you have experts in different areas. And I think what I believe is you can't be an expert in everything. And you got to have trust in other people to say, okay, I know I'm a fairly good chemist, right? But I know in order to make this happen, I will have to trust somebody else who has expertise in another area. And I need eventually to trust somebody who has maybe expertise in business or in finance. And a lot of scientists I meet, they say, oh, but the finance people are terrible because it's all about money and they're trying to squeeze the money out of me, and by the end of the day, cheat me. Sure, probably those people also exist, right? But by the end of the day, I think it will take these experts to come together to make a company work. And you earlier said, are good scientists good entrepreneurs? And I said, maybe, maybe not. I think one mistake I see is that scientists think, because I'm a good scientist, I'm also going to be a good businessman or a good finance person. And I think we got to know our limitations, and we got to say, look, we're going to have to work with people that know their trade really well, and we have to trust them to some degree. And then together we can do that. And I think if you cannot play in a team, then to create a successful company is very, very difficult. I would say impossible. But my experience also creating a really good Max Planck department also only works as a team, because you all realize, I mean, I'm sitting here now, but that's because I have extremely good group leaders, postdocs, PhD students, and without their work, I wouldn't be here and nothing would work. So by the end of the day, it's really about creating teams with different ages, different diversity, backgrounds, bring that together and make that successful. And it can be planned to some degree, but by the end of the day, there's always a large degree of randomness also.
What's your recommendation to build up such good teams, particularly if they're interdisciplinary, if you cannot really decide if they are good in their area because it's another area?
So I think you should have expertise in one particular technical area. So I have PhD students in immunology and I have PhD students in chemistry. And very few will be experts in both areas. Mm-hmm. And what I really don't want is people who are experts at everything because it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the day, experts in nothing. Mm-hmm. So you have to have one really strong area and you have to know a little bit how the other people talk. Mm-hmm. So we can communicate with each other. And I think by the end of the day, very quickly we'll realize, is the other person really, do we know what we talk about? Or do we just tell nice stories, but nothing happens by the end of the day? And I've had so many, hundreds of collaborations in my lifetime with my department. And I would say some really fantastic and we work with for the last 15, 20 years. And most don't work because there's not a compatibility and there's differences in what we would like to achieve. And by the end of the day, I think the goals of all the people on a team have to be aligned. Mm-hmm. If we form a team, it's only good for me, but it's really bad for you. Mm-hmm. Eventually, you're not going to play anymore, right? Because it's not good for you. And that's why the one thing I have realized in my life, I've always done pretty well when I work with people who have played team sports before. Because in team sports, sometimes you also have to give a ball to other people to play. You can't do it by yourself. And the team itself has to work together well, otherwise you can't win. And I think in science, it's also like that. And that means you have to have a level of trust in the other person. You have to trust them that they know what they're talking about, that they're going to do a good job. And if you can create that environment, I think then you can achieve almost anything. And that's what my main job as a Max Planck director, I think. It's a little bit like a coach. I need to find the best people. Max Planck helps in that, of course, but also having a successful operation. So if I can say, look, so far in my lab, 73 people have become professors. If you come here, the chances that you can do that too, maybe if that's what you're interested in, right? Our people have started companies, have been successful. This is something, there's a track record. If you have a good track record, it brings good people. But each new person is different. And that person also has to fit into the team. Mm-hmm. And you have to be able to get a little bit of biology together, get the team spirit together. That is our job, to hire people. And it doesn't have to be all the best people, because the very best chemist, if they are not compatible with the team, becomes a problem. Think about in soccer teams, right? If you have 11 players who are technically superb, but all hate each other, you have a problem. And in science and in business, it's exactly the same thing. And it sounds always trivial because people say, yeah, but it's so easy to do that. I think one of the things we have in science is that many of us scientists, and I don't exclude myself from that, we know we are pretty good at what we are doing. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here. But that also means you know everything. And my experience is, I certainly don't know everything. I know nothing. But none of us know everything. And we shouldn't be arrogant to other people. But really, we have to try to match these things together. And what we see with young students, they come in and they think, oh my God, I'm so new at a PhD, I don't know anything. And that's not true either. They know less, but they learn with time. The good thing about young guys is they say, okay, I don't know these things, but they try maybe things that I wouldn't try because I know I've done this for 30 years and this just doesn't work, right? Somebody else comes in fresh and said, don't know any of this stuff, right? Let me just try this. And they try something new and they may succeed. Mm-hmm. That's actually what happened to me. I've entered an area where people that looked into for 30, 40 years and said this doesn't work. Nobody can make carbohydrates automatically and this will fail what you're doing. I was naive. I said, I'll try that. I do this and this, and it worked. Well, maybe I got lucky, I don't think so, but I think maybe some good ideas plus some luck ended up working. And so I think it's really important to encourage young people to do that, but also young people to listen to what has happened before. But the old people also being able to not talk down to young people, but have it actually on even footing. And I think that's always easily said, but this intergenerational aspects also exist. And I think in Germany in the old days, it was very hierarchical. And this is why I left Germany. I was 3 years as a student, and without any degree, I went to the US and got a PhD. And I think in Germany, many things have gotten much better. I think the hierarchical structures have flattened to a large degree. They do still exist in some areas. But I think there are, of course, differences in experience and knowledge and everything else. But hierarchies that only depend on sort of military orders, in my opinion, don't work in science.
So it's a common goal, it's trust, and also space for freedom. Freedom to operate, freedom to try new things.
I think that's super important. That's what we always try to give people in a PhD. Of course, in a PhD project, as much as in a company, there's a certain amount of freedom you have to give. But also at some point, you know, okay, when do we stop this here? Because this is not going to be fruitful. And that is one area where I think is the most difficult part for us as a Max Planck director who directs research, because the people love their project. They say, if I try just a little harder and I go another 3-4 months, it'll just work, you'll see. and then you know, okay, at some point there's like 3.5 years when the time window of PhD ends, right? And you're getting closer and like, okay, if we go to a different project right now, you can still generate enough data to make sure you get a good PhD, right? Oh, I want to switch this. And I think that gets really tricky. The company could be the same thing, right? Oh, if you do that, then we can make it a little bit better. And if you do that, then it could be a really good product. But eventually there may be an end of the money, right, in this area. So I think the projects in a company and in academia may not be so totally different. I think the timing as to when you pull a plug on a project, that is, in my mind, really, really super hard. And the other thing I find really hard is to predict who is going to be really good at lab in my research lab. I've hired PhD students, and of course they all think they're great, and they're all great, right? But you have some people who are really going to become superstars, and some who are good but never going to become superstars. And to this day, I cannot predict it. We have people who come in from a background and say, oh, okay, we'll be pretty good, and they're just going to like develop really fantastically. And other people don't really reach their full potential. And predicting that, even after doing this for 27 years as a professor now, I still can't do it.
Is it about passion?
I think passion is super important, right? If you're not passionate, you probably shouldn't be in science, because honestly, I mean, being a scientist, doing a PhD, it's really hard. It's risky. It doesn't pay so well. So I think most of the people we have here, Max Planck in my group anyway, they're really passionate about what they do. And they're really fantastic. I think what becomes difficult then, it's not a sprint, right? It's a long distance race. So when you realize, okay, I've done this for a long time, eventually I become maybe tired because it's risky, I've worked hard, and a lot of things have failed, and things do fail a lot, right? And that's also why some people may say, well, I don't want to go to start a company because, again, I have this unsure future. I don't know what's going to happen, and I would like to have security. And I think if you want security and you want to have a secure job the next 5 or 10 years, let's say, then maybe starting a company may not be your best thing. And that's why I try to say earlier, when some people say maybe, okay, I don't want to do this right now, but I may do it at a later stage. Or some people, I always say the earlier you do it, the better, because when you're younger, you're not so used to making money. And so doing a company is maybe easier for you because you're not used to this monthly paycheck that comes every month. But I think it's very clear, you start a company, that's a humongous risk. And I think it can fail, but at the same time, you will learn things when you start a company that you will not learn in a large company. But again, some people can tolerate that risk and some people cannot. And if you cannot tolerate a certain amount of risk, I think then trying to be an entrepreneur is not for you.
Is it equal? The downside of taking the risk of failing on the one hand side, on the other hand side, what you gain, what you learn about being out there as an entrepreneur, is it equal that you say, come on, in the end, it's just okay?
I think it's difficult to say because you can do everything right.
Yeah.
And you can still fail.
Yeah.
I mean, in drug discovery, everything is great, looks fantastic in animal models and looks wonderful. It doesn't work in humans. We don't know why. That can happen. And that may cost somebody 200 million. And that's why drug discovery is a really risky business. I think that may be different in certain areas of engineering where you know, okay, I can build that instrument probably. Of course, the upside may not be as high as in drug discovery. And then you may make mistakes in between, but I think it's really, really difficult to say.
You mentioned it's hard to stop scientists when you feel that or see that it's not leading to the right direction. Did you had this feeling once that you found something where you're convinced this is amazing, this is great, this is something new, and you were stopped?
I was lucky because I had total freedom as a PhD student. My PhD advisor just let us do whatever we liked, which is actually one of the most difficult things that can happen to you. I think for many people it's actually easier if they have very, very tight boundaries and being told, okay, do this, do this, do this, because they know if I do all these things, by the end of the day, there will be sort of a check mark and I get my PhD or whatever it may be. And I think that's one of the challenges for people to actually go for a PhD. Because in the German, not just German, other systems as well, school system and more increasingly university system, it's more or less, okay, you go to class, you take the exam, you do a good job at the exam, check mark. It's not like in a PhD project. PhD project, you come to work every day at 8 o'clock and you work your whatever 8, 9, 10 hours, whatever you might want to do. And by the end of the day, you may have nothing. Not because of you are being stupid or lazy or whatever else, no, because it didn't work. And I think that is really, really hard to go from a very controlled system to something where you're not in control anymore all of a sudden. And I think that you have to have also personality-wise a certain self-confidence where you say, I know I didn't make a mistake, I did it technically right, I had a good idea, I executed everything, it didn't work. So did I make a mistake? Okay, I go through that thing, I didn't make a mistake. Okay, where did the mistake come from? Trying to find the error. And I think if you have no good self-confidence, you can't do that, because then you're always gonna just look for the error in yourself, and it may not be your own fault. So I think personality is something that we have all different ones, and some people may be more amenable towards, let's say, entrepreneurship versus other people, and that's not bad. I think it's just not something for everybody, and we shouldn't discourage anybody, but we should also not push people in this direction, because other people may go to entrepreneurship but don't really want to do that. Would maybe rather have a 9-to-5 job in a very safe environment, and that may be happier. And I think that's another thing I tell my students. By the end of the day, it's your life. You got to decide what's good for you. I got my life. I make my choices. For the most part, I'm pretty happy with my choices. Some things I probably would have done differently if I would have had a chance, right? But I think overall, everybody gets to screw up their own life. And I think we can only give recommendations and can try to guide people and mentor them. I think mentoring is very important. But I think we can never tell people, you have to do this, you should do this. I think that, in my opinion, leads always to disorder.
You're very active in open science, sharing know-how, sharing knowledge. You mentioned the ecosystem. Is sharing findings publicly and officially without any constraints, is this a part of the ecosystem?
No, I think that's stupid. Sorry to say. Look, I think you should share things openly, but if you are in an area where intellectual property plays a role, in drug discovery, that's very clear the case. If you disclose the results you have before you protect them through patenting our means, then there may be no value anymore. And I think there are means of doing this. If you know there could be a value, you can say, okay, I can protect it through patents, and Max Planck does that, and there's help within Max Planck, because in the beginning you don't know how to do that, right? Is it really worth it? You need outside opinions on that, but it doesn't mean that you cannot publish it. So I think everything should be published, everything should be shared. And some people say, but I don't want to patent it because I want everybody to use it. But that's a misunderstanding. If you do not protect something, the chance that it will never be used is really high, because people say, well, you know, I spent afterwards $1 billion to make a drug, and the next person just copies it, and I make no money, I don't get my money back. And if you don't allow people to get a return on investment, they won't invest. And I think that's a misconception by people. Sometimes they think, oh, I do the best thing by not patenting it. You can do like what we did for our production of malaria drug. We found a way, we patented it, and we said anybody who uses that process can use it for free if they make sure the drug prices go down. If they want to make more money because they have a cheaper way of making it, then we can give it for free, because you're just making more money. But by the end of the day, something like a life-saving drug for poor people should be, in my opinion, as cheap as possible, so that as many people as possible can get it so they can survive. I see other things where I would say, okay, I have no problem if things cost more money, right? But I think for life-saving drugs, for poor people, we really should make every effort that they are affordable for everybody. And for data, yes, data should be available. If you look at the publication process, this has become a humongous business with unbelievable rates of return on investments. And I think by the end of the day, that's also something that can be harmful to the taxpayers, because let's face it, by the end of the day, the research endeavor is paid by all of us, by the taxpayers. And as such, I think we can ask ourselves, where do we spend our money? Because the money is spent on things that are maybe too expensive or unreasonably expensive, that money is missing somewhere else. And so I think it's not just from a societal standpoint right to make data openly accessible, but I think it's also a right from a fiscal standpoint for a taxpayer.
For you, what's more satisfying, doing groundbreaking science or doing groundbreaking innovation and bringing this onto the market?
I like both things. I mean, by first of all, I'm a scientist. I like to do groundbreaking research. That's what drives me. So I don't come to work and think, oh my God, I need to start a company or something. No. So I'm excited talking to my students, seeing the results from the lab, and that is the best times. And this is why I'm in science, and that's why I never want to take on any major administrative roles in large organizations. Because at Max Planck, we have a chance to really be close to the experiments and work with young people I like. However, I refuse to say, look, if there's economic opportunity for trying to create value out of that, I think we should also do that. And if that's successful, that's also fun. It's also, by the end of the day, for me, I think what drives me personally is I want to do new stuff. I want to create new things. The reason I studied chemistry is very simple. My chemistry teacher once said, if you're a chemist, you can play God. Now, I don't want to get into religious things, that's not the point here, but the point is, as chemists, we can make things that did not exist before, anywhere. It's pretty cool. So in my case, it's boring. I make sugars, right? Make sugars never existed before, but those I can use afterwards to use them as drugs and as diagnostics and all sorts of things. And I think that is interesting because I can do something totally unprecedented and new, and it's different almost every day. And I think that is something that is, as far as a place to work is concerned, for somebody like me, absolutely perfect, because no day is like the next day. And I think that is really wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, you're an entrepreneur, completely lighted up. You're very optimist, but what I really like. Aren't you afraid that you find something that might harm?
I think that's a discussion we have all the time. I'm a chemist, and I can make things that help people, and I can make things that can kill people. Very, very simple. It could even be the same things because the dose depends on the dose, right?
But you can also kill people with water.
Of course, and that's what I tell people, right? I mean, by the end of the day, all my work is focused on trying to help people, but I also know that chemistry can be used to harm people. And however, it doesn't take the high-level chemistry that we do here to kill people. I mean, people buy a bag of fertilizer and blow it up. That can be also very effective. It is, however, my belief that the only way we bring mankind forward is by science, by technical innovation, and afterwards to be very cognizant of what that means for society. I think as scientists, we have to think about what are the consequences of what we do. Good, entrepreneurship, economic value. Bad, how can that harm people? What I'm doing right now, within Max Planck, we are setting up a new institute, Center for Transformation of Chemistry, where we trying to actually take away some of the things that were bad in the past. Because in the past, chemistry created so many new materials, right? 97% of all the things we consume are chemistry. But it all came from oil and gas and fossil resources, and a lot of waste was produced in CO2. So the impetus for the new center is to say, look, we need those materials, right? We're not going to go back to like wearing things that are colored, to go back to wear no soap or use soap, anything like that. That's always going to be there. So the question is, how can we make the products we need, but in ways that are less harmful to the environment? And that's actually where I see a lot of entrepreneurship opportunities in the future, where we may have not totally new products, but we may have products we use anyway, but these products are going to be much more benign to the environment. And I think going to a circular economy is something we got to go to. Not just because of the climate, but for many other reasons. We're running out of many of the fossil resources. So I see lots and lots of opportunities. So I hate to say, look, we have only problems. Yes, we have as mankind many problems we got to look at. But we should really think about how can we use what we know to address these issues. And we look at it that way, I think there's wonderful opportunities. And what makes me sad is when we see people that say, oh, okay, climate change, all these other problems are there. Just stop everything, just block everything. Blocking is not the answer. The question is, how can we come up with smart solutions to make things better? And there's so many areas we should be working on and we can be working on. And I find it really wasteful that people then don't work towards those things, but get depressed. And yeah, of course, there are many issues you could get depressed about, but I think you gotta act and do something about it. One thing that I personally refuse to work on are weapons, because that's something that I understand we need them in some cases, but at the same time, that's not something I like to use my intelligence to kill other people.
Yeah. Completely understand.
We have this issue in one of my second company. We found a way to make explosives. Actually, the explosives we worked on were the charges which in the car blow off airbag, or in the airplanes put all these little bags that come down in case there's breathing issues. We found a way to make it so efficiently that afterwards there were people interested in using that to weaponize it. And this is when I sold the company. because that's something I just want to work on.
What's your most favorite innovation? Leading back to your
My own work, I think there are two areas. Making a sugar, I know it sounds to most of you as like totally stupid stuff, right? But being able to make sugars really transformed the way how we make vaccines and drugs, and I'm proud of that. And the second area is this ability by, I would say, dumb luck and sort of falling through electrons into the oxygen and then into the malaria drug. We have recent results now where we have shown that these malaria drugs can be used to actually treat people that have had cancer, ovarian cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. And apparently it can block the cancer from coming back. So not cure people from cancer, but people have had surgery, but it block recurrence of cancer. Right now we have compounds in phase 2 clinical trials in this area in the United States. And I think if you would make it possible for those people suffering from cancer to live the rest of their life without having to worry it coming back, that would be really nice. And I think that's something that we hope we're going to take that a long way, but I'm fairly proud of that. Although I should say it wasn't really planned for beginning at all. And it was a lot of coincidence, a lot of talking to other people, as we talked earlier. It led to that and took it so far. And of course, one has to have a long breath of waiting, because that project's been going on for 13 years. And I think that's something that people also have to realize. If we make drugs, if we make vaccines, those projects tend to take between 7 and 15 years. And that takes a lot of time. And I think that's another thing, of course, in Max Planck for research in general. Max Planck gives the directors, the people who work here, a lot of trust, a lot of money up front. And of course, afterwards, we have to do something, but the trust is up front. And I think that is the greatest benefit that we have, to have this trust in us placed, that something comes out. And this is what I try to put in my students and my coworkers, is the trust. Look, you're here because you're really good. I trust that you have good ideas and move forward, and you really want to work hard and do that. And I think that trust is repaid afterwards by our coworkers. Of course, when you go then to start a company, you also have trust in the people you put together. But this is not just for fun anymore. If you lose people money, then that happens once, and not a second time. But I realized I was lucky that we done it now multiple times, and not unsuccessfully. So people realized, okay, if we actually invest in these ideas, then it is not only interesting science, but also economically, there's some benefit out of that. And we've done it a few times, and it gets easier with time, because people say, okay, that's a tried and proven thing, and we can go for that.
What was the best advice you got along your way, entrepreneurial way?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer. One of my colleagues at MIT once said, Peter, cash rules. So when you get paid or start a company, you should always make sure that also you don't just do it for stock options, because otherwise you may end up with nothing. And I think that's something we realize is when we are entrepreneurially active and we create companies, the science is great and the projects are great and creating something new is great, things I like, but by the end of the day, it's about money. And you start a commercial enterprise, the measure in business is money. And the companies you create, they should create a lot of jobs, but they only create a lot of jobs if it's actually a commercial viable enterprise. If you start a company only because you get no research funding, and I know some people have done this in the past, I think that's not a very good way of starting a company. By the end of the day, you have to be very clear, it's about economic success.
I think this is something that's very often underestimated. Everybody talks about sustainability, and a sustainable company is a company that earns money to continue to work. Because if you don't get the money, you're not sustainable at all, right? You have to leave the people. And I think this aspect is quite often underestimated, because from my perspective, it feels like that there's a little clash between money and science. Where does it come from?
So what we see oftentimes, and I see this a lot, they say, well, we thought you were a scientist and not just a guy who wants to make money. And it's exactly what you say. You have to understand that success and sustainability to do this for long run means there has to be money coming back into the system.
Yeah.
I think partially it could be a fact that people in science tend to be underpaid. It sounds funny coming from a scientist, but I think generally during education is less paid. People in academia are paid less than in industry. So it could be a certain maybe jealousy. Also, all these people in industry, they sold out because they make money now. I would say anybody who doesn't like it, they should then go and go where money is. That's also fine, right? You can always choose. And otherwise, I think maybe it's a particular German thing also. I spent 13 years in the US and 6 years in Switzerland. And I think in the US, that is less so. In the US, I think a good entrepreneur, or a successful entrepreneur, has a very high standing. And I think in Germany, we see a lot of jealousy in these areas. Oh, this person is sold out. They are now in the dark side in industry. Is everybody in industry great? No. Is everybody in academia great? No. There's always good and bad on both sides. But I think we need to divorce ourselves from this thinking of academia good, pure, industry bad, evil. I think we need to get away from this. And I think that is one of the biggest things and perceptions we see. So if you think of very, very trivial things, if I would say chemist, then in the back of most people's imaginary mind, they will see most likely an older male person in a white coat with pointy hair and things sort of smoke, right? And that is what we learn. But that's also not very helpful to some degree, because do I really want to be this person with smoky hair and a white coat and really boring, or I want to be something really cool, right? And I think that's where we have maybe also sometimes problems of convincing people to become scientists. And I think with public perception also in movies and other things, being introverted, being weird, just by yourself, that's not really helpful. I'm not saying you have to be one way or the other, but I think there's a certain stereotype that goes. And I think this entrepreneurial stereotype is very different from the scientific stereotype. And I think that's a little bit weird, actually, because it's not so easy for me to have stereotypes. I mean, they're all sorts.
Obviously, you have different ways to solve problems. And I wonder if the way of a scientist solving a problem is maybe even the same way as an entrepreneur solves problem, because they both are on a journey, they both have a goal, and suddenly there's an obstacle, and somehow they have to find a way to move around, and there's no one to ask.
So one thing I learned, I think that is maybe one of the worst things in science is, in entrepreneurship, there are certain timelines. You got to make a decision, or else the decision is made for you, and that's always bad. So I think even a bad decision is not as bad as the one that may be made by external forces. In science, that is not as much the case, right? In science, we don't have that, okay, we're running out of money tomorrow, Max Planck, that's not going to happen, right? In a company, there's sort of cash burn and certain urgencies. And I think the timelines within an academic environment, the pressures are different. I think that's also where some of the misgivings come towards exact timelines, and it has to be finished by this time. Oh, science can't be planned. It's correct, it's not plannable, but I think at least plan out what you're going to do, right? To some degree. And I think that's the difference in entrepreneurship, where basically you got to be aware of timelines, external pressure points, and you got to be ready to make decisions. And I think that's something in science where we oftentimes stay away from, because it may also lead to unpleasant things. You have to cut projects. You may have to cut people. We don't do that, right? Because for PhDs, obviously, we have to finance well time through, and it's good that way. But I think that is really one of the things where in business, in my mind, it's of course a little more clear cut. I want to say cutthroat, but more clear cut as to, okay, there are certain decisions to be made because there are external pressures and it has to be fulfilled. In academia, I see it a lot less.
It's actually interesting, because it's what's coming to my mind right now. I understand the timeline, that there's obviously a big difference on the one hand side. On the other hand side, on the quality of information you share, there's also a difference, because in academia it has to be 1000% sure, and in business it can be 80%, and sometimes it has to be, because you really don't know. Maybe this is the biggest difference.
I think a big difference, that's entirely correct what you're saying. The other thing is, you should always also make sure that you actually trust your data and that you're sure about this. Because if you convince yourself of the wrong thing, that can be detrimental in academia, less so, but it can be really the end in entrepreneurship. Because you think you really discovered something great and you convince yourself of that, and the customer doesn't like it, I think you've got a major problem. I think academia may get away with this for a little while at least, but self-perception can be a difficult thing.
So if you have a recommendation for scientists, one sentence, what would it be?
Do what you like. Do what you think is interesting. Don't let me tell you what is interesting, because that doesn't work, because I chose for me what's interesting. sometimes by accident, sometimes by choice. Keep an open eye and see what's out there, what's possible for you. Try to go to top places, because I think that's where top science is being done. It's a little bit like in sports, right? Where different leagues, and the different leagues also exist in science. And if you have an opportunity to play in the top leagues, play there. It will be a little more competitive. You have to work probably pretty hard and be technically good to do that. But that's where the real fun is. And then also take opportunities as they exist, right? Because I mean, a lot of the things can't be planned. And I mean, it's always out of the life circumstances at the time where you make those decisions. But if you don't take any risk, the high rewards won't be there. They won't be there in academia. They won't be there in entrepreneurship. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it really in life there are opportunities. And if you don't take those opportunities, then afterwards you shouldn't complain that you didn't get as far as another person who did take those risks, right? And the other thing is you will fail, and well, get up and try again. It's a really weird thing because that's what people tell you all the time. But if you never really try hard, then probably the really difficult stuff is not going to be attained without working hard and trying hard and also failing at it. I would say people always say, well, all the things you need to learn, you learn in kindergarten. And I think that's actually true in science to a large degree, right? Be nice to other people, play nice with them. And so there's a lot of truth to this. And people overcomplicate it oftentimes. And it is not that complicated. And the other thing is you probably be nice to people because both in science as well as in entrepreneurial aspects, you meet the same people again multiple times and in different roles possibly. So what goes around comes around eventually, and people talk to each other. And I think you need to build a reputation of being reliable. Science is reliability, and our reputation is everything we got, right? And I think in business is the same thing. If people give you money and you lose it and don't make anything out of it, well, you're probably not going to get it again. And I think that's for people to be understood.